Hey there. It's been a little while, but I am going to be slowing down for the holiday season, but I did want to come out with a video that's probably been my most requested subject matter to date for quite a while now. And that is sort of getting beyond just the math hammer of what are the best lists, what are the best units, and getting into actual sort of how to play games. Um, I'm not going to lie, I've been hesitant to make this kind of content in the past um, just because, without much of a tournament scene, a few places are running tournaments, but there's not sort of a big competitive scene. Um, there's not sort of a ton of places where you can watch people who have been winning games in a tournament play against each other and study what they do, right? So any kind of tactics are going to be things that people are picking up in these small spaces, not really comparing against each other, not having tournaments where they actually try their fanciest tricks against each other to figure this stuff out. So any kind of um, sort of tactics stuff, I don't think advanced Warcry tactics exist, I guess is what I would say. Um, but I am convinced that there are some things that kind of can take you from beginner to intermediate. Um, and I'm just going to sort of go through here things that I've noticed either are the reason someone lost in my games or are sort of reasons that people have lost in some battle reports I've watched, stuff like that. Um, things that I think a lot of people are going to know a lot of the things here. Maybe some of this will be new to some folks, but I do think that this video is going to be a great guide for anyone if it's you or someone you're sort of playing with, who is a beginner looking to be more kind of intermediate with their in-game tactics. I wouldn't call myself sort of an advanced, strat tactics master. I think I've put a lot of work into the strategy of this game, but less into the tactics, just because there's fewer opportunities to test it, right? Um, you're only really kind of testing against the people you test with. Uh, so, you know, we're going to just go into at least some things to get into the intermediate level and see see what we can teach here. So, the first thing, uh, anytime someone asks the question online in any of the groups, right? Facebook, Reddit, Discord, you know, how can I get better at this? Why am I losing games? Or I played this really high tier warband and lost to a low tier warband. What's wrong? Or like maybe that person, like whoever told me it was high tier is an idiot. It's always a lot of people responding with play the objectives, right? Which is one of the least helpful um, pieces of advice I've ever heard. People use it in AOS and 40K too. Completely unhelpful there as well. Like obviously you play the objectives. Now, um, I do know I've watched players not play the objectives, right? There is a certain level of beginnerdom where you do ignore the objectives, or there are just some people who that's not their idea of fun, and so they ignore them when they play. They just try to murder the other person's army. And, um, if that's your idea of fun, right? Why are you watching a tactics video? Um, I'm joking. Please keep watching. Uh, but what I mean is that, we get it, we know, but play the objectives is not it's not a detailed enough thing to say. So let's talk about, some of the types of objectives or missions that come up in Warcry and, what actually playing them can mean and some sort of ways that you want to move around in them. So one is treasure missions, right? Um, Classically, a treasure mission is there's a piece of treasure sitting there. You have to get it and hold it, and you either score points by holding it each round, or it's whoever's holding the right treasure at the end of the match wins. And something you will see people do sometimes, again, maybe this is, maybe you're way beyond this, maybe nobody in your play group does this, but I've also seen people do it, and it's not a great idea, is grabbing the treasure and then still just running into fight. So run away. I think, that'll be obvious for a lot of people, but some other kind of layers to that is if you can have an escort, uh, to your person running away, do it, but make a sort of a more nuanced sort of cost benefit of the value in points of that escort versus, what it could be doing in a more aggressive role. But having an escort to your treasure holder is really important because one thing that happens a lot is you use your last activation or your last action in your activation to kill the creature or the fighter holding the treasure, and then you don't have you're not killing it with a leader, right? So you can't use inspiring presence to give another one of um, your fighters sort of priority. And so then your opponent just, if they have an escort to their treasure holder, can just go in, grab the treasure, and keep moving. Um, so when you're in a treasure mission, you really have to plan against that, both for yourself and for the opponent. So if you can, you always want to have that escort to your treasure holder to pick it up when they die and keep running away. And for opponents, really good to attack treasure holders with at least two, and hopefully one of them. The best thing you can do in treasure missions is to kill the treasure holder with your leader. If you can't do that, you really want to, excuse me, pin down the escort before you kill the treasure holder. So basically, taking a chaff model, getting into combat with the escort, then going and killing the treasure holder, so that the escort has to waste a disengage, then go get the treasure. Then they can't use a whole movement to get away from you, and then hopefully next round you have them 2-on-1. Um, so those are just some really basic sort of what it looks like to specifically move around, what your objective is in a treasure mission. For hunter-killer missions, just some basic tips and tricks. Um, the target group, only one of them has to survive. So by the target group, I mean the three hunter-killer missions where it's destroy the shield, destroy this, destroy that. Only one has to survive, so you can send one or two of them into combat, to try to fight the other person's target group if you want. This is especially the case when, let's say, um, your best attacking unit is in your dagger and it's kill the other person's dagger. Um, you would be giving up a lot of equity if you weren't using your attacking unit to be attacking. So maybe it's often better to just protect one unit and to get your attacking unit attacking because that's what it's good at. And if it can take out things that would hunt down your one target unit, that's really valuable. That's what its job is. And so just because something is a target unit doesn't mean it has to be running away. And then for single target missions, try to move your target fighter last. Um, this lets you sort of do a few extra things to protect it. The biggest is using its own damage. So in a couple of the ones, right, so there's Cut Off the Head and there's Bloodmarked. Bloodmarked is my absolute favorite mission in all of Warcry. But both of them sort of lend themselves to putting a fairly elite unit as the target unit for the Hunter-Killer mission. So um, if you have that sort of more elite unit, it probably has a pretty respectable damage profile. Um, and so if you sort of use two activations to run away right away, well then you're kind of you're probably in a pretty safe place, but you're just there and you're sitting there, and so your opponent can really just plan to just get there, right? Whereas if you wait to activate it, whatever your target unit is, you can, um, one, you have a better sense of where you need to run to when you do start running, and you can use your own damage to protect your target unit. So by that, what I mean is if they do run something up to you to fight you, um, it's if you just get to double attack it and you manage to take it down, that's actually more valuable to you than if you had just run away and they had never caught you, right? Because now you're actually draining their resources and you're draining their ability to catch you next round. Um, so yeah, that's my only real advice there. It would be just try to move your target fighter last. Um, For objective missions that are actual objective missions, a few things to think about. So one is actually go there, right? I have seen people not go to the objectives. Generally, those people seem to, I think usually they know that they're playing to have their version of fun as opposed to playing to win. But you never know. Sometimes somewhere someone needs to hear that. Do actually go to the objective. Um, Once you're there, or sorry, before you actually the one thing about actually going there, just remember you only have to deploy wholly within 3 inches of a deployment point. So you can lean towards the objective, right? You can have your deployment point, say your objective is 10 inches away. You can deploy like right on that 3 inch line, and so your objective is only 7 inches away. Um, just something that's a good idea to do. Sometimes you do see people just like stick as close to the point as they can. You can really, you can really push it a little bit. Um, Now, the thing once you're actually up to the objectives themselves, there's a couple things to think about. One is understanding sort of power projection. Who has the ability to put the most force onto this objective? One, uh, who has the ability to put the most force easily onto the objective? And who has the ability to put the most force if they have to on the objective? Those are two different things. I wish I'd made a separate bullet for that, but um, it's an important thing to remember. So where that sort of affects how you play is to know when you actually go to the objective, are you going to it to then deal damage to try to take it, or are you going to it to stay alive and force the committal of bodies, right? So I think about this once. I had a Red Harvest game recently where the objective um, was right next to some lava, and I could either kind of I was sort of approaching it from the side so I could go either way on the lava, and I could either run into where the objective was and where the opponent's forces were to try to fight them, or I could just try to get onto the like in that little spot on the other side of the lava where you're still technically within 3 inches of the objective. And sort of you're not actually getting any fighting done there, but you're forcing your opponent to put two models there to outnumber your one, which then decreases their ability to get onto other objectives. Um, and so that was a really interesting sort of decision to make is do I actually want to fight here? So don't automatically, when you want to get to an objective, don't just automatically try to fight. A lot of the time you can protect yourself. So I've sort of put this terrain, this fake terrain here, and put this demon out here as kind of an example of how you might want to be hiding on the objective, or you might be wanting to actually get in there and fight on the objective. And those are two very different goals. And you really need to think about if your opponent can easily overwhelm you on the objective, going in there and fighting probably isn't the best. But if they can easily overwhelm you on that objective and you go in there and you force them to actually overwhelm you on the objective, a lot of the time that'll drain their resources so that they can't overwhelm you on a different objective, which lets you fight, clear them off of that objective, etc. So um, try to, trying to sort of force action on an objective without actually fighting is a really valuable thing to do. Um, Also, walling objectives off is really, really important and something you often don't see people do. I think a lot of people who try to play competitively do this. I think you hear it a lot in AOS and in 40K, but I've kind of positioned this fiend here as kind of an example, this fiend of Slanesh sort of example base, right, of an oval base that's pretty big and you position it so that it counts as within 3 inches of an objective, but someone coming from this direction, engaging it in combat, won't be within 3 inches. So they'll have to use a lot more movement to get around it to get into the objective. Um, I think that that's a really important thing to do, especially in in a good board that has a lot of terrain. Your opponent will often be kind of constrained in terms of how they can actually move. Like imagine if there wasn't just this terrain here, but like another terrain over here or something, right? Um, your opponent would be really constrained by having that fiend there. So I think that's a really important thing to sort of restrict your opponent's ability to get to the objectives is actually walling them off, putting your putting your bases kind of straddling where the objective is so that you can do that. So just some basic tips there for just objectives themselves. Um, the kind of next big concept that happens a lot in Warcry is target selection. A lot of this kind of goes over from the big games, but some of it's very specific to our game. So uh, let's just get into it. Sometimes, the mission will dictate your target. Um, so right? A lot of hunter-killer missions in Warcry where you have to specifically kill one thing. The only thing there is, so one, don't get distracted unless you're having fun, right? Actually go on and kill the things that your mission tells you to kill. But the one time when it's worth it to maybe deviate is you want to think about both the thing you have to kill and the things that your opponents have that are going to be really good at killing what you need to keep alive. And it can be worth it to take some time to kill whatever your opponent's sort of best hunter is. Um, like if your opponent has a gorehound, you're going to want to pin down that gorehound, or if you can, take it out, right? Or if your opponent has Zangor Enlightened on disc or something, something like that, that's really good at just going in and killing a target unit. That's going to be a high priority as well. Um, it's also worth talking about hammers versus anvils. So um, there's a million things. Lots of ink has been spilled in various wargaming communities about sort of the difference between the two concepts. But I'm just talking here about what you're targeting for your own damage output, whether it's a bunch of shooting sentinels like I've shown here, or whether it's just say a big mounted unit that could come and attack multiple different things. Um, if you have two equally attractive targets, you're best off putting your damage as early, as fast as you can into the more glass cannon unit. So if two units, same amount of points, um, they're both sort of, they're both the thing you have to kill. They're both on an objective or they're both, um, you know, part of your target group. Um, you want to kill the one that does more damage and is easier to kill, right? Um, so yeah, try to avoid having to fight your opponent's anvils. Um, they're sort of big, defensive, chunky beasts. Do whatever you can to avoid having to fight them as often as you can. The other thing is understanding your own firepower with your target selection. You don't want to be um, putting damage into something that you want to kill without putting enough in, right? Especially because in this game, big units, they fight at full strength through their entire wounds profile. So if you put in, if your opponent comes in with, say, uh, a giant, one of those FEC flyers, right? Like the Infernal Courtier flyer, um, 315 points of just like total destruction, you don't want to just bring a couple sort of strong-ish units into it and just kind of hope, because you're going to have a bad time because they'll take 20 wounds off it before they get taken down, but they are going to get taken down, and then your opponent still essentially has this massive flying damage monster, right? That's going to be a problem for you. Um, so, you know, most of the time, you don't actually want to be fighting them, those things, unless you know you can kill them. Um, Most of the time, you want to be putting most of your damage onto sort of the easier to kill targets. Now, not all of the time, but just as a rule of thumb, especially because most of the highest damage efficiency units in the game, the ones that do the most damage for their points, most of them are pretty small, actually. It's things like giant rats, or sort of famously, if you play against Slanesh, right? Fiends of Slanesh, really hard to kill. Demonettes, really easy to kill, and demonettes and fiends do the same amount of damage, and so obviously the demonette has twice as high damage efficiency. Um, the biggest thing in that force is the mirror, which again is your highest priority, but if you can't kill it in your round, then you probably want to kill their demonettes so that they can't overwhelm you on the objectives or kill any of your things because the demonettes are where their damage comes in. So just in general, right? I think You don't want to attack those elite units unless you know you can kill them. You do often, though, want to pin an elite unit, so just bringing a chaff towards an elite unit, especially if it's a chaff unit that they're going to have to spend two attacks killing instead of just one. That can be very effective for you as far as keeping their monsters sort of at bay. Um, but don't just kind of send random mid-sized units trying to fight monsters because you'll have a bad time. Um, you won't get enough return out of the investment if you do that. Um, if you are going to sort of commit to killing a monster, it can be useful to send something at it first to pin it down when you have a bunch of things that can go attack it afterwards. Because then if it goes and kills the thing that was pinning it down, then it's still in the same spot, and then you can bring a ton of stuff to go attack it. Um, so sort of that brings us into sort of commitment versus reprisal. Um, One of the things that I think makes this game really interesting from a strategic perspective is that you get into these standoff situations, like our two bros from Reservoir Dogs here, because there's a lot of situations where whoever attacks first is at a huge disadvantage. The reason being, move plus attack does half as much damage as two attacks, right? That means that the reacting unit is going to have the advantage unless it's already committed. Um, so you want to be really careful when you go attack something. If you just attack something that hasn't gone yet, you're going to have a bad time if you don't just kill it right away. Um, though there is kind of levels to this, right? So there's sort of a push and pull where you can um, go and attack something, tempting it to go kill what you've done, and now it's committed, and now it can't have its reprisal against something else that comes and attacks it. As soon as something has moved, has activated, it seems obvious to say it, but it can't activate again that round, right? So you want to think about that in terms of um, once something has moved into a place where you can reach it and it has already activated, that's when you really want to mob it if it's a high target thing because you can move, attack it once, and then going into next round, it's a roll of the dice who's going to get to attack first. Um, so that can be really important, right? Because um, and you also want to think about it for your own play. So because elites, much like I said with sort of holding back target units in single target missions, elites are just protected by the threat of their own damage. You can't go attack an elite unit because it'll just kill you, as opposed to a chaff unit where it can be really valuable. One of the things I value so highly in this game, I say it in so many videos, is any unit that can kill a chaff unit in one shot. Um, but one of the things that makes those units good is that even if they fail, the chaff unit's not just going to kill them, right? They can then finish off the chaff unit maybe with an ability next round, or maybe just with one attack and then go move on. But when you're attacking an elite, you know that most elites will just really blow you up with both of their attacks once you've actually attacked them, um, unless they've already committed. So you want to commit your elite units as late as possible in any given round. Um, Unless, some warbands do have abilities that really sort of incentivize you to go early. Anytime you're going up against the mirror, you're going to want to be moving early um, with your elite units. Anytime sort of you're vulnerable to netters, you're going to be wanting to move early with your elite unit. And so that makes netters and mirrors and things like that really valuable even when they're not popping off, right? Even when your netter isn't about to go use its ability. And there's like a ton of different netters in the game. It's just named after the 45-point goblin that does it. Um, but that makes netters really valuable, right? Because it forces your opponent to um, actually commit their elites, which makes it more easy if you do need to kill the elites to actually take them out. Um, the level 2 of this strategy, I almost hesitate to even bring it up, but the level 2 is the quote unquote distraction Carnifex. That's a strategy that I don't really believe in, to be honest, but a lot of players swear by it. Essentially, you bring in something big, scary, that your opponent thinks they have to deal with, that they're actually better off ignoring, but they think they have to deal with it. And then you tempt them into making a poor decision by attacking it, and wasting a ton of resources doing so. So sometimes, this is kind of a low power level example, but you can use the Ogre Breacher this way out of Iron Golems, for example. You can just double move it towards your opponent, and sometimes they'll just attack it. Um, the reason I don't love Distraction Carnifex as a strategy is it assumes that your opponent has less of an idea of what's actually going on in the game than you do. Um, so it's essentially just a pub stomping strategy. It's if your opponent is less skilled than you, they will fall for the Distraction Carnifex. Maybe they won't. Maybe you're at a high enough level where even though they're less skilled than you, they still won't fall for it. But if your opponent is kind of a sort of more novice player, um, or just doesn't understand the game state very well at the point in time, they will fall for the Distraction Carnifex, waste all their resources killing it. It's all fine and good. But you were going to beat them anyway, right? You were going to find a way. So actually telling people of like whenever someone talks about the distraction Carnifex as this like amazing strategy that they've got that works every time, all that tells me is that their opponents aren't very good, right? Because it puts a lot of choice in your opponent's hands, right? It's let's let's bring this to Magic, which I know a lot of people hate, but there are a lot of cards in Magic called Punisher cards, like Browbeat is one of them, where it gives you these two things that can happen that are both very powerful, but your opponent gets to choose. And a lot of people love these Punisher cards, like Vexing Devil or Browbeat, where because both sides feel so powerful. But the thing is, when your opponent gets to choose which poison they're taking. Um, if your opponent is really good, they're going to make the correct choice, and you're not going to win. So that's a long tangent to go to for one thing, but essentially all I would say is the strategy of throwing a beefy elite forward to force your opponent to kind of waste resources dealing with it, I don't think is a very good strategy, but it will beat newer players. Um, But let's get into some other stuff. Ranged units are a big sort of problem, I think, for newer players in the game. And I don't think a lot of people, I think, are really dismissive of players who struggle against range. Maybe because it's more dominant at lower levels of play than it is at higher levels. This is kind of it is what it is, right? And I think it's important to be really sort of realistic with people about sort of why it happens, because it is really hard sometimes to figure out the best way to outmaneuver ranged units. So just some small things to think about for this is one, a ranged unit has to melee you if you're within 1 inch of it. Um, so sort of getting fast units who can sort of run down and pin the elite or sort whatever shooters you need to pin, um, I think is really valuable. But a lot of the time, um, the ranged thing, like if it's an Ogre Thunderfist, right? The ranged thing, you don't really want to be in melee with it either, right? Or like if your opponent has Storm Fiends or something, like you really don't want to be in melee with those. Um, the same, the Kurnoth Hunter leader, right, with the bow. Um, but a lot of ranged units also have a blind spot where they can't shoot closer than 3 inches. Um, and they'll usually have 1 inch melee range. So they have this 2 inch sized blind spot where you can hide an important unit. Um, and so you don't necessarily have to be behind terrain to hide from ranged units because this forces them to sort of waste an activation getting you out of their blind spot, right? They have to move back or move away, to kind of get to where they can actually shoot you. And that's going to make them do a ton less. damage to you. It's going to chop their damage output in half. So I think that that's a really important thing. Any sort of high value target that you have um, within, you know, its base has to be less than 2 inches wide. So the biggest things in the game can't do this. But a lot of really, high pointed, high value um, units in the game can fit in that 2 inch blind spot, especially because, these are concentric circles. So even some cavalry units that might have a base that's longer than 2 inches, they can still fit if they get in sideways there. So I've sort of created a kind of a situation here that did come up in one of my games, but it's kind of an idealized situation of you're on an objective, you have your unit that is a fairly important high damage unit, and your opponent is going to be ahead of you 2-1 on this objective. They have a ranged elite and a chaff unit. Um, you can go in and kill that chaff unit without being in a space where the ranged elite unit can then get a double attack on you and maybe take you out. So you can just kind of position yourself into the blind spot in order to do that. And if you're on the other side of this, um, you're just going to want to make sure that if you do have chaff and elites in the same place, either they're right next to each other base to base, or they're sort of spread pretty far out from each other, um, so that your opponent can't hide into your blind spot and be fighting the chaff. Um, so kind of to recap, right? Throwing a worthless unit in within 1 inch to pin a shooter so that they can't snipe your valuable targets is really, really valuable in this game. And it's one of the reasons why having really crappy chaff units like, say, giant rats, aether wings, is incredibly valuable because um, that 45 point unit or that 35 point unit or the spider can stop your opponent from killing something really valuable, right? So you've actually saved hundreds of points there. Um, and then for important fighters that you don't want to get shot, you always want to be aiming for that 2 inch blind spot or to get behind terrain. Um, the other thing, of course, if you can just close with if you have something that is going to win the melee fight, obviously get in there as fast as you can. But otherwise, try to stick to those two rules of it's either blind spots and terrain for high value units, or it's getting in there and pinning with chaff. One of the reasons why I always advocate sort of as high numbers on your warbands as possible. So finally, I think finally, yep, we have activation sequencing. Um, so this is just talking about the parts of a turn. When I look over sort of what happened in my games, I notice, at least for myself, that properly using weight is probably the weakest aspect of my game, like in game. There are often a lot of places where I would have had activation advantage if I had waited with something that wasn't going to be doing anything in particular anyway, and then done that early in the round so that I had more sort of space to look and force my opponent to commit to things. Um, so let's break down actually what's in an activation. I think a lot of people kind of breeze through this, even because it's sort of obvious within the rules, but it's also not obvious in that people just kind of go. Um, you get a window to use an ability, then you make an action, then you have another window to use an ability, then you make an action, and then you have another window to use an ability. And it's really worthwhile, I think, to look over your warband's abilities and for each one to think about when you would use it right away, why you might use it in between, and why you might use it um, at the end. And to make things more complicated, you know, the ways that you have an activation are either move, uh, wait, then move, wait, then attack, or attack, move, attack, or attack if you're living the dream. Um, so you can think about sort of with each, that was it 6 or 8? possibilities there. I think it was whatever. Um, you can think about each ability in each of those scenarios because each warband really only has usually two, three, sometimes four abilities that are sort of really, really useful in them. So you can think about them and in terms of where they fit in the ability windows. And that's, I think, um, sort of one of the biggest differences between someone sort of piloting a warband well versus not well is understanding each ability and how it fits into the activation sequence. Um, I think is, whenever you watch someone play with their, with a warband, you can tell if they're used to it by sort of their confidence and their mastery of the ability timing within the activation sequence. I think this is absolutely one of the things, like, let's say, for example, with a major Warcry tournament having just been announced for Adepticon, if you are practicing for Adepticon, this would be one of the places where I would say you can get the most value from practice because a lot of it, a lot of it is like get good, bro, right? Like a lot of this stuff, you know, either occurs to you mid-game or it doesn't, and it's really kind of unfair to ask someone to sort of magically be better without just playing a lot and sort of doing it over time. Um, But one of the places where you can get sort of vastly better results in your games without necessarily becoming a smarter person or, like becoming a genius of the game is thinking about each of your abilities and thinking about where they fit into your turn. Um, because if you're prepared and you're sort of confident with those answers, um, you can get a ton more value out of those abilities without having become a magically better player. Um, so I think that if I was practicing for Adepticon, and I think probably in February I'll be putting out some videos about specifically that, um, that would be one of the first places I'd practice with whatever warband I'm going to do. I'd probably look through and whatever the three most important abilities were, I would probably make like an actual spreadsheet of sort of when I want to use what I get out of them in each portion of an attack sequence or an activation sequence. I think that's really important. So there's sort of a roundup of what I would say are some of the most important things to remember that I see people miss. I'm going to be so if you haven't caught it, I was in a battle report video with Arctic Horde Wargaming. I really suggest you check it out. Um, in that one, um, we ended up with a tie, and there were a lot of sort of interesting decision points that it was a game. I think my opponent, Chad, mentioned that he felt lucky to come away with a tie, or not necessarily lucky, but he felt happy with it. He felt like I had been in the driver's seat most of the game and that he was able to kind of steal a tie at the end. So I think there were some interesting decision points um, about sort of why I ended up with a tie. And I'm going to be putting out a video probably early in the new year about sort of the mistakes I made, the tactical errors I made that allowed my opponent to steal the tie when, I probably could have found a way to win the game. Even though uh, the uh, the one that one is the burning objectives one does come out with a lot of ties in general, but still I think worthwhile thinking. So I'd like to kind of use the lessons in this video to try to show you uh, in my own play. The reason for that being, I really don't think of myself as sort of an advanced tactician in this game. I already sort of mentioned that a couple times that I'm much better at strategy than I am at tactics. But I do think it's sort of worth talking about because this is something where I don't think there are a lot of people out there who are actually great Warcry tacticians. We haven't been testing against each other sort of as a wider community. Um, and I really look forward to doing that for, Adepticon. So I'll get into kind of breaking down one of my old games that way, and we'll see where this discussion goes. If you have more to add, I really want to hear it. So please do leave a comment or two down below, um, and also hit a like button. Um, it's really cool in my opinion that GW is kind of committed to actually making tournaments happen for Warcry. This is something that really hasn't been very common in the history of the game. It's only been very small LGS tournaments. So um, I'm really excited about that, and I'm really excited to get the conversation going about that. So every like and comment that you put on this video, sort of it helps the algorithm kind of push it forward and get people talking about the game elsewhere. So really does make a difference. And thanks a bunch for watching. Until Adepticon, may all your rolls be crits. Hopefully not at Adepticon if you're playing me.